Part of Cuban exile, all eyes are on a scheduled transition of power. And if all goes as planned, in a matter of weeks, Cuba will have a leader who is not a Castro for the first time in more than half a century. Raul Castro plans to cede that title, though it may not mean he cedes the power. Local 10's Hatzel Vela reports from Havana.
2 weeks out, and Miguel Díaz-Canel remains the favorite, likely the next president of Cuba. April 19th is when Cuba's new parliament will vote for new leadership, including a new president, most likely the first in decades not named Castro. It's also the first time in years the leader of the Communist Party and the leader of the Cuban government will be two different people. Raul Castro will remain the first secretary of the party until 2021, arguably a post more powerful than the presidency in this one-party communist system. Díaz-Canel is a trained engineer who worked his way up through the Communist Party as provincial secretary and now as first vice president. It's been reported Díaz-Canel is a seasoned, pragmatic politician who shies away from big crowds but is said to be more relaxed with smaller groups. If chosen, Díaz-Canel would inherit a complicated Cuba. The socialist-run island is at a crossroads when it comes to the economy, its allies, and U.S.-Cuba relations. On the economy, Cuba is struggling. Castro has publicly said the country must end its dual currency system. The new president will also face pressure on what to do with economic reforms. Late last year, the Castro government decided to stop issuing private sector licenses. Since then, Cubans have been hungry for those to be reinstated.
The policy of the United States toward Cuba.
With the Trump presidency came the cooling of U.S.-Cuba relations, complicated even further by the alleged health attacks on American embassy workers. The relationship is so icy now, the White House has already announced President Trump will not meet with President Castro in the upcoming Summit of the Americas in Peru. Trump is now surrounding himself with Ambassador John Bolton and Secretary of State nominee Mike Pompeo. Both men have been highly critical of the Cuban government, and their assignments could signal tougher times ahead. In Havana, I'm Hatzel Vela for This Week in South Florida.
Our thanks to Hatzel, and we begin right there with Ambassador Vicki Huddleston, who served under Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush as chief of the U.S. Interest Section in Havana. She is also author of a new book called Our Woman in Havana, an insider's account of the complicated relationship between the U.S. and Cuba. It's so great to have you here. Thanks so much for coming in.
Well, thank you, Glenna. I'm delighted to be here. Well, who could ask for more to be
nobody.
In South Florida?
Nobody. Well, okay, so you heard Hatzel was reporting that Díaz-Canel will inherit a complicated Cuba. From our perspective here in this newsroom, Cuba has always been a complicated place. Is it getting more complicated?
Well, one of the reasons Cuba is a complicated place is because the United States has a punitive and hostile policy, which Trump has reimposed on Cuba.
With those words, we see politics here right away, which are not the politics of exile, of course. And there are two sides to that story.
Of course there are.
But with this change of power, which is historic, almost sounds like not enough of a large word to use. Is it, though? Will things change? And how will the U.S. react to that?
Okay, I think they'll definitely change. Díaz-Canel was born after the revolution. He's 57. He has to prove his credibility to the Cuban people. And the best way for him to do that is continue the reforms in the private sector that Raul Castro had started. But unfortunately, it's going to go slow because now that the United States under Trump is threatening again, rather than engaging, Castro and the Cuban hierarchy are pulling back those reforms. So we're missing a huge opportunity.
Well, we'll talk about that. I think it's important to note that as the chief of the U.S. Interest Section, you did a report for the Brookings Institute, which largely became the blueprint for President Obama's plan to engage in 2014. So much of that has been rolled back now, and I think the biggest critique we hear was that it was so unilateral. We gave everything and got nothing. Is that a fair assessment?
No, I don't think so, because with most countries, whether it's Russia or China or Vietnam, who we established normal relations with in '95, we don't have a unilateral comprehensive embargo. And so in a way, the playing field is not level with Cuba. And so we're starting from a point where we have this horrendous embargo against Cuba that retards to a great deal the future for Cuban kids.
And so what would your then idea be to sanction, if you will, Cuba for human rights abuses, political prisoners, and the things that the exiles lost, properties? What is the kind of plan you see that would work, that would balance that trade?
Perfect question, because if we were engaging Cuba, we could talk about compensation for the expropriated properties and for the many losses of the Cuban community that's now in South Florida and around the United States. So it makes sense to engage, because then we help begin a process where we're thinking of our national interest. When we push Cuba, we push it into the arms of China and Russia. In fact, they're now gaining more and more influence in Cuba.
Do you think during the 2 years or so that President Obama's plan was in place, we saw some, in our travels to Havana, we saw more private businesses on face value. Mm-hmm. Do you think there was a fundamental change, or a change in what some might call window dressing? Were the people of Cuba served by that?
Okay, let me give you an example. When I was in Cuba, I was head of our mission from 1999 to 2002. When I would ask Cubans, how are things? They would kind of go, no es fácil. We're talking about Castro.
It's not easy. No es fácil.
Right. And now when I ask Cubans, I've been there a couple times since Trump reimposed some part of the restrictions, as well as this drawdown of our embassy, and Cubans can't get visas to visit families or to immigrate to the United States. And when I ask Cubans now, how do you feel about the future? They look so desolate, and they say, Trump. So we're blamed for this.
Well, the United States has been being blamed by many in Cuba
and
for a very long time.
And so that's why we should get rid of the embargo, so we're not blamed, and give Cuba this opportunity to reform, so that the private sector can really change things in Cuba, because it will.
The embassy has been bare bones staff. I think there are 10 people left in what was the embassy for the last couple of years, and as you pointed out, services, the actual service component of the embassy has been severely curtailed. Do you see any movement there because of the what are perceived as sonic attacks? That's what happened. Diplomats came home to keep them safe. Do you see, what are the changes in store there? Are there
Well,
any?
It's tragic. When I was there, I saw a chain around the embassy gate, and it wasn't put there by the Cubans, it was put there by us. So our relationship diplomatically, although we're an embassy, is now lower than it was before we had relations, which were restarted in 1977.
Because of the health of the diplomats who were harmed in some way?
I believe there was no attack, that in fact this was listening devices. You know, the Cubans listen all the time. They listen to me. They listen to everybody, particularly intelligence and security officers. And a recent study of the University of Michigan says that it is possible, if there's 2, 3 listening devices, that the frequencies can interfere with each other.
Accidental.
Accidental is probably the most likely thing that happened. But what is really unfortunate is that we use the intelligence to downgrade relations.
So much more to come on that. Thank you so much for being here.
Good
luck on your new book, Our Women in Havana. Look forward to reading that.
Thank you.
All right.